Welcome to the Paradays channel. Today we explain Prophets Kings 1, chapter 21 in a clear and simple way, step by step. Now, before we look at the very first verse, we really need a quick bit of context about exactly where we are in the story. So, we're up in the northern kingdom of Israel, and King Ahab is on the throne. Ahab has recently witnessed some absolutely massive, undeniable miracles. I mean, we're talking about the famous showdown at Mount Carmel with the prophet Elijah, where fire literally came down from heaven, right? But, despite seeing the undeniable power of God firsthand, Ahab's moral compass is still deeply fundamentally flawed. Today, we're going to dive straight into a narrative that honestly reads a lot like a modern political thriller. It's a dramatic, unforgettable story about power, corruption, and the ultimate consequences of our actions. Let's break down the original Hebrew text carefully so you can see exactly how this intense drama unfolds.
Here's our agenda for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the king's demand. Second, the queen's deadly plot. Third, the prophet's confrontation. Fourth, we'll see the king's repentance. Fifth, we'll draw out some practical life lessons. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a quick chapter recap. Okay, moving right into section 1, the king's demand. This covers verses 1 through 4.
You know, it's really fascinating how a massive moral failing and a huge national scandal often begin with a highly localized, seemingly trivial dispute. The chapter opens in verse 1 by setting the geographic scene. Now, Ahab's primary royal capital is in Samaria, but he also maintains this beautiful winter palace in a lush, fertile region called Jezreel. Enter a local man named Naboth the Jezreelite. He owns a beautiful vineyard right next door to Ahab's palace. Now, the king of the entire nation looks out his window at this vineyard and just decides he wants it. Ahab approaches Naboth and says he wants to convert this vineyard into what the Hebrew text calls a gan yarak, which is literally just a simple vegetable garden. I mean, think about the sheer pettiness of this for a second. Ahab is a king. He has vast wealth, multiple palaces, huge tracts of land, yet he completely fixates on this one minor, ordinary plot of land simply because it happens to be conveniently located next door.
So, continuing into verse 2, Ahab makes his offer. From a purely secular, business perspective, the king offers what actually looks like a completely fair trade. He approaches this as a standard commercial transaction. He basically says, hey, let me have your vineyard, and offers either a better plot of land somewhere else in exchange or the exact fair market value in silver. If we look at the pure pashat, just the simple literal meaning of the text here, we immediately see Ahab's fundamental flaw. To a secular, materialistic king, absolutely everything is just a commodity. He assumes that because he has the money, the authority, and the power, everything has a price tag. He totally expects a quick yes and a newly expanded palace garden. But then in verse 3, Naboth bravely rejects the king's offer. And you really have to notice carefully what Naboth says here. He doesn't just say no or, try to haggle for a higher price. He refuses on strict theological and principled grounds. He invokes the tetragrammaton, the holy name of God, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." This isn't just a polite no thanks to a real estate deal. It is a direct religious rebuke of the king. With this single sentence, Naboth shuts down the negotiation entirely and knowingly creates a huge, high-stakes conflict with the most powerful man in the entire kingdom.
To truly grasp the heavy weight of verse 3, we have to clarify a critical Hebrew concept. The word used here is nachala, which means an ancestral inheritance. You see, under biblical law found in Leviticus and Numbers, the land of Israel didn't ultimately belong to the citizens, or even to the king. It belonged to God. God originally allocated the land to the Israelite tribes, and there were strict Torah commandments forbidding individuals from permanently selling their family's allotted land away from their lineage. So Naboth isn't just being a stubborn neighbor here, he's being a faithful servant of God. He's choosing strict obedience to God's law over the king's very attractive financial offer.
So what happens next? Let's dive into section 2, the queen's deadly plot. This covers verses 4 through 16.
In verses 4 through 7, we see how a king's pout turns into a highly lethal conspiracy. Ahab's reaction to Naboth's refusal is incredibly revealing of his character. The literal Hebrew text tells us that the king goes home sullen and angry, lies down on his bed, turns his face to the wall and refuses to eat. Seriously, he acts exactly like a passive, sulking child who has just been told he can't have a new toy. Well, when his wife, Queen Jezebel, comes in and asks why his spirit is so sad that he won't eat, he complains that Naboth won't sell him the vineyard. Jezebel's response creates this sharp, chilling contrast. She berates his weakness, essentially saying, "Are you not the one who exercises kingship over Israel?" She immediately takes this aggressive, arrogant control, telling him to get up, eat, and be cheerful, because she is going to hand him the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite herself.
Verses 8 through 10 outline the terrifying specifics of her plot. Let's walk through this step by step, because it's wild. Jezebel doesn't just hire a thug to kill Naboth in an alley. No, she weaponizes the legal system to orchestrate a chillingly legalistic murder. She writes letters using Ahab's name and seals him with the royal seal. Her instructions to the local elders are deeply sinister. Step 1, she orders them to proclaim a public fast. In ancient Israel, a public fast was called when a grave hidden sin had caused some sort of national crisis. This immediately creates an atmosphere of deep suspicion and religious fervor. Step 2, give Naboth a prominent seat at the head of the assembly, basically setting him up for a catastrophic public fall. Step 3, hire 2 specific men. The Hebrew calls them B'nai Belial, which translates to base fellows, or basically completely lawless scoundrels. You see, Jezebel brilliantly exploits the Torah's own requirement that it takes 2 witnesses to convict a man of a capital crime. These scoundrels are told to publicly and falsely accuse Naboth of cursing both God and the king. Finally, step 4, using this fabricated charge of blasphemy and treason, they are to take him outside the city and stone him to death.
Verses 11 through 16 detail the absolute cowardice of the community leaders. Tragically, the local elders and nobles, the very men tasked by God with upholding justice in the city of Jezreel, they cave instantly to the crown's corrupt pressure. They follow Jezebel's written instructions to the exact letter. They hold the fast, the B'nai Belial tell their lies, and Naboth is violently stoned to death outside the city walls. Once the grim deed is officially done, they send a simple, cold message back to Jezebel. Naboth has been stoned and is dead. She receives the news and just casually walks in to tell her husband to get up and take possession of the vineyard because the man who refused to sell it for silver is no longer alive.
This brings us to Section 3, the prophet's confrontation, covering verses 17 through 26. I want you to look really closely at verse 16. As soon as Ahab hears that Naboth is dead, he doesn't even pause. He doesn't ask how he died. He doesn't show a single ounce of hesitation or guilt or mourning. He immediately gets up to go down to the vineyard to take it over. The Hebrew verb used here is lareshet, which means to take formal possession or to inherit. So he is literally walking through the soil of a stolen property, claiming the very vines that were watered by the spilling of innocent blood. The psychological state of a king who is so utterly divorced from basic morality is just staggering.
But then, in verses 17 through 19, heaven dramatically intervenes. God sends the prophet Elijah the Tishbite on a direct collision course with the king. Elijah intercepts Ahab right there, standing amidst the vines of his newly stolen property. When Ahab sees him, he recoils and says, "So you have found me, my enemy?" Elijah replies, "I have found you," and then delivers a booming, inescapable accusation directly from God. In Hebrew, it's this famous, piercing question, "Haratzachta v'gam yirashta?" which translates to, "Have you murdered and also taken possession?" This incredibly concise phrase just strips away all the legal fiction, the sham trial, the royal decrees. It perfectly encapsulates the entirety of Ahab's sin. God exposes the naked truth. Ahab is a murderer and a thief.
And Elijah doesn't just bring an accusation, he brings a horrifying sentence. Elijah proclaims a strict measure-for-measure justice, which is known in Hebrew as midah keneged midah. Because Ahab was completely complicit in the shedding of innocent blood, God declares that in the exact place where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up Ahab's own blood. It is a graphic, terrifying, and perfectly balanced promise of divine justice.
Verses 20 through 26 expand this prophetic judgment into total devastation for the royal family. Elijah declares that because Ahab has so completely sold himself to do evil, his entire royal house, every single male descendant, will be completely cut off and wiped out. He actually compares Ahab's fate to the ruined, destroyed dynasties of Jeroboam and Baasha before him. And as for Jezebel, the architect of this wicked plot, her prophecy is uniquely grim. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel, leaving her unburied. At this point, the biblical text provides a direct editorial comment, just to emphasize that there was truly no one quite like Ahab, who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, actively urged on and spurred by his wife Jezebel.
Now get ready for a twist in Section 4, the king's repentance. This is verses 27 through 29.
Given Ahab's track record of extreme wickedness, you'd probably expect him to arrest Elijah on the spot or lash out in violent anger, right? Instead, in verse 27, we witness a profound personal collapse. Upon hearing these words of doom, Ahab genuinely humbles himself. He actually tears his royal clothes, puts rough sackcloth against his bare skin, fasts from food, and walks around meekly. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern context, these actions were not merely symbolic, and it wasn't just a polite show of regret. Tearing your garments and wearing sackcloth was the extreme physical manifestation of absolute terror, deep mourning, and an entirely broken spirit. Ahab is utterly crushed by the weight of his impending judgment.
Verses 28 and 29 deliver a massive theological shock. The word of the Lord comes to Elijah again, and God points out Ahab's complete change in posture. God says to Elijah, "Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me?" Because of this genuine humility, God actually decrees a stay of execution. The ultimate disaster prophesied for his household will not be brought during Ahab's lifetime, but will be delayed until the days of his son. This is a huge, monumental shift in the narrative. It proves that God's justice is always tempered with mercy. I mean, even for a king explicitly described as the most wicked in Israel's history, sincere, physically manifest repentance invokes a measure of divine grace.
Let's move to Section 5, Practical Life Lessons. What are our core takeaways?
So, now that we walk step by step through the literal text, we really have to ask ourselves, how do we apply this to our own lives today? Well, first, we learn the extreme danger of unchecked coveting. Ahab's desire for a mere vegetable garden started small, but because he felt entitled and lacked boundaries, it spiraled into state-sponsored murder. This is a huge warning to us about the modern traps of endless consumerism and entitlement. Second, Naboth exemplifies the immense courage required to stand by your principles. He held on to his spiritual integrity, refusing to sell out his faith even when he was pressured by the wealthiest, most powerful figures in his society. Third, we see the tragic cost of cowardice. The local elders who falsely convicted Naboth show us exactly what happens when good people remain silent. By just following orders to preserve their own status, they became fully complicit in profound evil. And finally, Ahab's ultimate reaction teaches us the profound power of true humility. If the worst king in Israel's history can tear his clothes and find a delay in God's judgment, it reminds us that no matter how deeply we have failed, genuine, sincere repentance is always heard by God.
Finally, Section 6, Chapter Recap. Let's look at the timeline of events. Let's lock in our understanding by methodically reviewing the timeline we've just uncovered. We have to remember the who, what, where, and why. It all begins in Jezreel with King Ahab's petty demand to acquire Naboth's ancestral vineyard just for a vegetable garden. When Naboth refuses out of faithfulness to God, the situation rapidly escalates. Queen Jezebel engineers a ruthless, fully legalistic conspiracy using false witnesses, the Bnei Belial, and a fabricated religious fast. This entire machinery of corruption leads directly to an innocent man being unjustly stoned to death outside the city. But, as we saw, justice does not sleep. God sends Elijah to confront Ahab with those piercing words, "Have you murdered and also taken possession?" The chapter then surprisingly concludes with a wicked king stripping off his royal pride, putting on sackcloth, and humbling himself before God, which results in a delayed but guaranteed divine judgment.
As we look at the dark legacy left by this stolen vineyard, it leaves us with a real lingering question. If God's ultimate justice was merely delayed to the next generation and not completely canceled, how will the consequences of these horrific actions eventually shape the future of Israel and bring about the final ruin of the house of Ahab? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.